The Alco RS could easily be seen as a locomotive that changed how the railways functioned and looked. The RS1 would bring the age of diesel traction to the rails and condemn steam locomotives to the museums. This is the how and the why the early RSs were so revolutionary. In today's video, I'll be going through the first 3 RSs, discovering their development. I'll also be discussing their derivatives such as the RSCs and the RSDs by both MLW and Alco. If you do enjoy these sorts of videos, do subscribe and like this video, as it does help a lot. Next week's video will be about an iconic passenger train, named the Canadian, while also discussing CP's other flagship, known as the Dominion. So tune into that to learn about one of Canada's most famous transcontinental trains. While the RS1 was not the first diesel locomotive, nor the first mainline diesel locomotive, it would set the standard. The RS1 would have its origins with a simple request by the Rock Island Railroads. They wanted a locomotive that could be used on branch line passenger duties in the Midwest. Road switches are locomotives that could shunt cars and yards while being able to haul freight cars on the main line as well. While this concept was not foreign, EMD had produced the NW3 in 1939 for the Great Northern Railroad. However, these were simply an extended NW2 with road-going trucks and a steam generator. EMD would actually ignore this section of the market initially, focusing on switches and mainline units such as the EMD FT. Alco would actually produce the first successful production road switcher locomotive. The RS1 would use a simple 6-cylinder, 4-stroke, forced induction engine named the 539T. It would produce 1,000 horsepower, also featuring mainline trucks that would allow the RS1 to travel up to 65 miles per hour or close to 100 kilometers per hour. They would feature a slightly raised cab to give better visibility in both the front and rear of the locomotive. The long hood of the locomotive would feature the engine, while the short hood would feature the steam generator. Initial production of the RS1 would begin in 1941 March. 5 railroads would actually order the RS1. These were the Milwaukee Road, Atlanta and St. Andrews Bay Railroad, the Rock Island Line, New York Susquehanna and Western, and finally the Tennessee Coal and Iron Railroad. In total, 13 locomotives would be built for these railroads. However, with America's entry into the Second World War, these 13 locomotives would be seized and transferred to the US Army. They would be used on the Trans-Iranian Railway to supply Russia with war material for the fight against Germany. The 13 locomotives would have to be modified as the loading gauge in America is different to the one in Iran, and it would have to be modified to fit the tighter clearances of Iranian tunnels. To achieve this, they modified the cab by sharpening the roof taper. They would also feature new trucks to suit the lighter late track, causing them to change from a 2-axle truck to 3-axle truck design. One important modification to allow for the installation of the 3-axle trucks was the relocation of the underbody fuel truck. The most important modification out of all of these was a conversion to chain-style coupling instead of the AAR coupler. This was because Iran had been using the British-style chain and buffer-style coupling. These would create the first RSD1s, and the reason for this was the usage of diesels instead of steam was quite simply the lack of good water on a Trans-Iranian railway. This would make the RSD1s a good match for the tunnels and harsher areas of the Trans-Iranian Railway. The first 13 would be renumbered from 8000 to 8012, and 44 RSD1s under the specification. When the second batch of E1645 RSD1s arrived in March 1943, multiple working would be fitted to allow for the double heading of freight trains. The second batch of RSD1s would be named 8013 to 8056. On some return journeys, some will have spotted to have 5 RS1s working on a single train. The second batch would be used in a mountainous region between Artemsk and Iraq. One issue faced by the war trains was roaming bandits of the Lur and Bakhtratis, nomads, who were aiming to rob the trains heading to Russia, as they would be filled with all sorts of goods. They would be armed with all sorts of weapons from knives, spears, and rifles. It reached a boiling point when train crews were permitted to carry weapons to defend the trains from bandits. These scenes would have been easily reminiscent of a John Wayne movie. The trains would also have to contend with Nazi sabotage and sympathizers of the previous Shah of Iran. Incidents such as explosions, missing equipment, and track obstructions. This would take a toll on the crew itself. When the trains would eventually reach Soviet-controlled areas, issues would arise from cultural differences and issues with alcohol. One incident would nearly end up with an engineer nearly being shot. This was due to a drunken soldier being angered due to being asked to leave the cab of an RS1. The soldier would actually discharge their firearm into the electrical cabinet of the RS1. The RS1 would ultimately be successful in good at being at the role they were given, to allow crews to simply being able to breathe and not have to deal with the toxic smoke inhalation they'd have to face if they were driving steam trains across the mountains and into tunnels. The Soviet Union would ultimately be impressed by the RS1s, and they would want a version for themselves. No major modification would be made, however the trucks would be regauged to 5-foot gauge. This version would be named the E1646 variant. 70 of these would be requested by the Soviet Union, however only 68 would be received, as 2 would be lost at sea by U-boats. These RS1s would be classified as the SZD DA-220 class. With the Second World War ending in 1945, the Cold War would begin. This would cause America to cease exports of locomotives to the Soviet Union. This actually created a problem for the Soviets, as they had actually liked the RS1 and actually wanted more of them. This would lead them to create their own derivative of the RS1. This would be named the TE1. I do want to highlight that's not a very strict copy, like the B-29 and the Tupolev-4 situation. Kharkov Diesel Factory No. 75 would be responsible for the study and replication of the RS1. However, some changes would be made to suit the needs of the Soviets or to make things easier to produce. All the measurements would be converted to metric. For example, things like nut and bolt would be converted to metric. Systems such as the Westinghouse air brake would be changed to the Matrasov system distributor, and a larger battery would be fitted. Between 1947 and 1950, 300 would be actually produced. Uniquely, the TE1 would actually lend itself to being the genesis for Soviet diesel locomotive. It would actually create the first large-scale mainline diesel locomotive of the Soviet Union. The TE1 would actually be used as a base for this. The TE2 would use 2 TE1s semi-permanently coupled, fitted with a car body, and with 2 two-axle trucks instead of the original 3. Over 500 of these TE2s would be produced and would become incredibly successful in their roles. They would manage to replace double-headed steam on the Orenburg line, and this TE2 would spark further development in diesel locomotives in the Soviet Union. After the Second World War, the RS1s used in Iran would be shipped back in 1945. Due to the heavy work they performed in Iran, they would have to be overhauled at the military railway workshop. Some of these RS1s would be retained for the US Army. However, 36 of the original Iranian RS1s would be sold off to the Alaskan Railroad. All 36 of these would be in Alaska for 1951, and another 8 would be leased to the Alaskan Railroad. Due to the design of the RS1 suffering in sub-zero temperatures, causing maintenance and driving to be difficult, the RS1s would be rebuilt into shrouded units resembling a car body design like the EMD F series. The RS1s would be actually converted back into RS1s by swapping their 3-axle trucks for 2-axle trucks. all of these Alaskan units would be fitted with multiple unit control. With the end of the war, RS1 production would be resumed. The RS1 would have 300 produced in total, with the National Railway of Mexico having the largest order of 64, and Brazilian railroads ordering 46 in total. The largest domestic order would actually be for the Minneapolis and St. Louis Railroad. The RS1 would actually stay in production despite newer models such as the RS2 and 3 replacing it in the catalog. In the catalog, the RS2 would be a technical successor to the RS1. Two major improvements would happen. The body would be rounded for a smoother body look, and the larger change would be the new engine. Instead of the previous 539T engine, a brand new 12-cylinder turbocharged engine named 244 prime mover was introduced. While the RS2 was more powerful than the RS1, where it produced 500 more horsepower, the 244 prime mover was problematic as it was rushed through testing and would have a terrible reputation for being unreliable. The 244 would be initially known for failing in service. This was due to issues regarding faulty crankshafts. For example, the first 20 244-powered freight locomotives for the GMO would suffer engine failure. This meant that the whole locomotive would have to be sent back to Alco for fixing. The issues with the 244 prime movers crankshaft was initially due to the poor design for the crankshafts. Even with the later design and forged crankshafts, failures still happened due to the poor metallurgy of these initial components. The air-cooled turbocharger would also struggle in terms of cooling. While these problems were not unique to the RS2, and it would rather plague the whole Alco locomotive catalog until these issues were later fixed. The RS2 would begin production on October 1946. It would start to face competition from other larger locomotive manufacturers such as Baldwin, EMD, and Fairbanks Morse. In 1947, Fairbanks would release the H1544, and EMD would match with the BL2 locomotive, while Baldwin would also showcase the DRS 44 1500. This was a massive problem for Alco, as Alco would no longer be the only company producing road switches, and plagued with the engine issues, there was a fear of other companies, such as EMD, catching up to them. The RS2 would be replaced by the RS3 starting in 1950. The RS3 would manage to be the most produced Alco, with 1,418 produced between May 1950 to August 1956. The RS3 would manage to fix a lot of the issues that had plagued the earlier RS2. A new and improved variation of the 244 prime mover would be introduced. The 244C would feature new engine mounts, crankshaft design, and the new GE air-cooled turbocharger would be replaced with a RD4 water-cooled turbocharger in 1953. Later on, it would actually be replaced by an Alco-designed water-cooled turbocharger as well in 1954. Turbocharger would be replaced with a RD4 water-cooled turbocharger in 1953. Later on, it would actually be replaced by an Alco-designed water-cooled turbocharger as well in 1954. The RS3 would face some of the hardest competition out of all the early Alco models. They would now face updated models from the big manufacturers. The competition would be the new FM Baby Trainmaster, Baldwin's AS16, and the toughest competition of them all, the EMD Jeep 7. All the new models for the 1950 market, with the exclusion of the Jeep 7, made 1600 horsepower. The RS3 would be more reliable than its previous iterations and would ultimately be more successful than Baldwin's and FM's offerings. However, issues with getting repairs and spare parts for Alco's products would cause EMD to take the lead in the road switcher market. One solution that many railroads took to improve the RS3 was to upgrade the power plant. Penn Central would actually rebuild many of the Alco RS3s with the EMD 567B prime mover from retired EMD E8s. This rebuild program would begin in 1972 and would continue under Conrail, ending in 1978. In total, 98 Penn Central RS3s would be upgraded to this new EMD 567 prime mover. 2 railroads would actually upgrade their RS3s with the newer Alco 251 prime movers. The reason for this was due to more power and just vastly greater reliability. The Delaware and Hudson Railway would actually use Morrison and Cudnance to rebuild 8 RS3s and to improve power by using the newer Alco 251C prime mover. As well, the Green Bay and Western would rebuild theirs with a slightly later 251E prime mover. Like the previous generation, there would also be an RSC model. These would mainly be for export into foreign markets. However, some domestic railways, such as the Soo Line, would order them. Australia would actually be one of these markets, and MLW would actually be responsible for introducing the first ever mainline diesels in my home state of New South Wales, Australia. These were named the 40 class and they would be ordered in a batch of 20. They would be very similar to the original RSC3s by Alco. However, they would have some subtle differences such as the cab shape and the placement of the handrails. They would originally be used on the Sydney to Broadmeadow, Newcastle heavy freight services, also nicknamed the Short North. They would also be used on later North Coast services to Brisbane and on the main south to Albury. One of the highlights of their careers was 2 40 classes would be used on the 1954 Royal Tour. 2 40 classes, 40001 and 40002, would be repainted into the royal blue for the tour. Later on, all 20 would be repainted into the New South Wales Government Railways paint scheme at the time of Indian Red. They would be retired starting in 1968, with the last being retired in 1971. Some parts of the 40 class would later be reused in the later 442 class, nicknamed Jumbos. Quite simply, these trains are very iconic, and there's plenty of them in museums, operational, or in preservation, taking heritage trains all around the world. It is easy to say that these trains had a massive impact on the railroads of today. Unlike a lot of the trains on this channel that I've covered, I do actually have my own experience regarding my own RS3 or the New South Wales Government Railways 40 class. I've actually managed to see it at least once a year, where it actually hauls some of the original Southern Aurora cars into Central Station. Now for context, the Southern Aurora was a premier Sydney to Melbourne train. It was the fanciest train in Australia at the time. It's genuinely a sight to see, and I would genuinely recommend, if you do ever get a chance to visit Sydney, and you are visiting in October, to go for the Transport Heritage Expo, where you get to see some of these unique heritage of Sydney. One thing I will actually say, I haven't done it, but I will probably end up doing it this year, is booking for the tea special, where you can experience tea on the old-fashioned Aurora carriages. So, yeah, scones and jam for everyone. Before I say goodbye, I do want to notify you that I will be doing a Q&A about trains, so anything like the dead man paddles on Tangaras, or just general questions about trains in general. I am also quite happy to also answer some questions about the videos, or just, overall questions. And I will answer these questions to the best of my ability. So just drop these questions down in the comments below, and I'll make a video answering them in the future. Just want to say thank you for watching this video. Thank you to my partner for supporting me in this hobby. Thank you, and have a good night.